What if the Second World War didn't begin with the sound of gunfire, but with the scratching of pens on parchment, June 28, 1919? The Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles gleamed with chandeliers and fury. German representatives, humiliated, surrounded by victors, signed a treaty they had no power to refuse. The cameras captured their faces, but not the true weapon being loaded that day, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It declared Germany solely responsible for the Great War and bound the nation to pay 132 billion gold marks in reparations, an amount so enormous it could never be paid in 100 years. But the point wasn't repayment. The point was control, because hidden within the treaty's fine print was a financial loop, a circular debt system that would turn Europe into a banker's playground. Here's how it worked. Germany would borrow money from American banks to make reparations payments to Britain and France. Britain and France would use that same money to pay their own war debts to the United States. And American banks, the same ones providing the loans, would collect interest at every stage of the cycle. It was elegant, cynical, and profitable. Germany became a debtor not to its conquerors, but to its creditors. The nation was no longer governed solely by Berlin, but by Wall Street. The system's brilliance was in its invisibility. To the world, the Treaty of Versailles was about justice and punishment. But behind the moral language was the cold machinery of finance. Germany's industries, railways, and even customs revenues were pledged as collateral. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, would soon be restructured under American advisors. On paper, the Great War had ended. In reality, a new kind of war had begun, one fought not with tanks or trenches, but with interest rates and international signatures. And like every war built on debt, it carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The victors thought they'd crippled Germany. Instead, they'd created the conditions for a second catastrophe, one that would make the first look merciful. By 1923, Germany was collapsing under the weight of reparations. Factories silent, workers starving, wheelbarrows of paper money couldn't buy a loaf of bread. Inflation had devoured the economy so completely that children played with banknotes instead of toys. And just when the world thought Germany would disintegrate, the Americans arrived. Not with armies, with accountants. In 1924, the Dawes Plan was born, a masterpiece of financial engineering disguised as economic rescue. Its architect, Charles G. Dawes, an American banker turned diplomat, proposed a simple fix. Let American banks lend Germany the money to pay reparations. Problem solved on paper. The lead financier was J.P. Morgan and Co., orchestrating a consortium that loaned 800 million gold marks to the German state. But this was no act of charity. Every loan came with conditions. Germany's national budget tax collection and industrial revenues were placed under international supervision. American advisors occupied key ministries. The Reichsbank, the nation's central bank, was partially privatized, its policies no longer dictated by Berlin, but guided by New York and London. This wasn't a bailout. It was financial receivership. A sovereign state turned into a corporate subsidiary of global finance. The result, Germany's economy stabilized temporarily. Factories reopened, railways ran again, and the mark regained value. But the prosperity was an illusion powered by borrowed dollars that had to be repaid with interest. Each year, Germany borrowed more from Wall Street than it paid out to its European creditors. The system worked only so long as American money kept flowing. By 1929, this fragile balance was restructured again under the Young Plan, extending the payments over 59 years until 1988. Imagine being told your children and grandchildren would still be paying for a war they never fought. That was Germany's reality. To manage this permanent debt cycle, A new institution was created, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, founded in Basel, Switzerland. Its purpose to oversee the transfer of reparations, but in practice it became the central bank of central banks operating beyond any national law or democratic oversight. The Dawes and Young plans turned war debt into a self-sustaining machine. Money flowed in circles, Germany to London, London, to New York, back to Germany, with profit extracted at every rotation. On the surface, peace had returned to Europe, but beneath it the ticking of an economic time bomb had just begun. For 5 short years, Germany looked reborn. Berlin shimmered with jazz clubs and neon lights. The mark was stable, and the newspapers spoke of economic miracle. But miracles built on debt always end the same way, with collapse. In October 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed. Billions in paper wealth vanished overnight. American banks, the same ones lending to Germany, called in their foreign loans to cover domestic losses. The flow of capital to Europe stopped instantly, and just like that, the entire post-war financial system imploded. Germany's economy rebuilt on borrowed dollars shattered first. Factories closed, exports evaporated. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly 1 in 3 workers. Those who still had jobs watched their wages fall by half. Farmers lost land, shopkeepers lost customers, and the middle class, the heart of German society, dissolved into poverty. The Versailles system had done exactly what it was designed to do: make Germany dependent on external credit. When the credit disappeared, so did the illusion of sovereignty. The Weimar Republic, already despised for signing the Versailles Treaty, became the face of national humiliation. And in that chaos, a new kind of politician began to rise. Adolf Hitler. He wasn't yet the monster history remembers not in 1930. He was a desperate man in a desperate nation, shouting promises that finally made sense to people who had lost everything: order, employment, dignity, and above all, freedom from debt. But here's what most history books ignore. Hitler's ascent wasn't purely ideological, it was financially enabled. Even as the Depression deepened, select German industries, steel, coal, chemicals, continued to receive foreign investment. Those funds, quietly managed through the Bank for International Settlements, kept flowing long after American credit supposedly dried up. They went not to social programs or relief efforts, but to the very corporations that would later fund the Nazi Party. By 1933, when Hitler was appointed chancellor, the global financial elite had found their solution. He promised stability, discipline, and most importantly, repayment of debts. For the bankers who feared a communist Germany more than a fascist one, Hitler wasn't a threat. He was a guarantee. The Great Depression had turned the world upside down, and in that void, the failed artist from Vienna became the perfect instrument of a global balance sheet. When Adolf Hitler seized power in January 1933, Germany was bankrupt, starving, and politically fractured. Within 6 years, it was the most formidable industrial power on earth. How does a ruined nation transform into a military superstate so fast? The answer isn't ideology, it's financing. Behind the rhetoric of nationalism and revenge stood the cold precision of balance sheets. Hitler promised to rebuild industry, create jobs, and restore pride. But rebuilding requires capital, and the money didn't come from inside Germany. It came from Wall Street. American banks and corporations saw opportunity where others saw chaos. To them, Nazi Germany wasn't a moral question. It was an investment. General Motors, through its German subsidiary, Opel, became one of the Nazi regime's largest vehicle producers, building trucks for the Wehrmacht. Ford Motor Company, whose founder admired Hitler's efficiency, ran German factories that supplied military vehicles throughout the 1930s. Standard Oil, controlled by the Rockefeller family, entered into patent sharing agreements with IG Farben, the chemical giant that produced Zyklon B, the gas used in concentration camps. Through joint ventures, they developed synthetic fuel and rubber vital to Germany's war machine. Even IBM, through its subsidiary Die Homag, provided the punch card systems that allowed the Nazi bureaucracy to catalog populations, a technology later used to track Jews and political dissidents. In 1937, IBM's president Thomas J. Watson received the Merit Cross of the German Eagle personally awarded by Hitler for his service to the Reich. But the financing went deeper than industry. It extended into the heart of global banking. Prescott Bush, a partner at Brown Brothers Harriman and director of the Union Banking Corporation, managed assets tied to Fritz Thyssen, one of Hitler's earliest financial backers. In 1942, the U.S. government seized Union Banking's assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act, but by then the damage was done. Meanwhile, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, established to manage reparations, quietly became the clearinghouse for Nazi gold and international transactions. Its board included representatives from the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the Reichsbank. Even as Germany rearmed in open violation of Versailles, money continued flowing through Basel, untouched and unregulated. When Hitler spoke of restoring Germany's financial independence, the irony was staggering. Every rifle, every tank, every plane was financed, patented, or insured by the same transnational interests that had once crushed Germany under debt. The world mistook this for recovery. In truth, it was a rearmament financed by the very bankers who had engineered its despair. September 1st, 1939. The world calls it the start of World War II. But for the bankers and creditors who had shaped 2 decades of economic policy, it was something else, the collection date. When German tanks rolled into Poland, they weren't just reclaiming land, they were reclaiming collateral. During the 1920s, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania had all borrowed heavily from German banks under the Dawes and Young plans. When the Depression hit, those debts went unpaid. The Nazi invasion wasn't only about ideology or living space, it was about seizing assets that had been defaulted on. Steel, coal, oil, agriculture, each conquest added a new ledger of resources to the Reich's balance sheet. Behind every blitzkrieg was a bookkeeping operation. The Reichsbank, under Hjalmar Schacht, the same economist who had negotiated Germany's earlier debt restructurings, created a shadow financial network to extract wealth from occupied territories. Factories in Czechoslovakia and France were taken over by German subsidiaries. Banks in the Netherlands and Belgium were forced to liquidate gold and transfer reserves to Berlin. Even personal savings accounts were drained under the guise of occupation costs. France alone was forced to pay 860 million marks annually to fund its own occupation. That's right, the conquered financed the conqueror. Every mark sent to Berlin helped stabilize German accounts and service international debts. The war wasn't bankrupting Germany, it was profiting it. And as incredible as it sounds, American financial connections continued throughout this period. The Chase Bank and National City Bank of New York, later Citibank, maintained operations in Nazi-occupied Paris until 1942, cooperating with German authorities and freezing Jewish accounts to maintain access to European capital. Trade with German firms persisted under neutral intermediaries. Standard oil tankers shipped fuel components to European ports via third-party routes. Money found its way through Switzerland, Spain, and Sweden, neutral nations that served as financial laundries for Nazi commerce. To the public, this was war, a battle of good and evil. To those managing the balance sheets, it was something simpler: asset redistribution. The invasion of Poland triggered global outrage. But for creditors, it also unlocked frozen debts, raw materials, and a vast captive labor force. For the bankers of New York and London, Hitler's armies were not only soldiers, they were collection agents in uniform. By 1941, Europe was burning, but America was booming. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago ran day and night. Ships carried supplies across the Atlantic long before the U.S. entered the war. The truth is, World War II began as a European debt crisis and ended as an American financial takeover. When the U.S. joined the war in December 1941, it did so not as a debtor nation, but as the world's creditor of last resort. The same banks that had lent to Germany now financed both sides directly through industry and indirectly through government debt. Every bomb, every tank, every bullet had a bond behind it. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed Washington to loan arms and equipment to Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. But these weren't gifts. They were debts that would later be repaid in dollars, resources, or political loyalty. By 1945, Lend-Lease totaled over $50 billion, equivalent to about $700 billion today. It made Britain, once the world's creditor, the world's biggest debtor. The British Empire collapsed under the weight of those obligations. For the first time in 200 years, the pound sterling was no longer the foundation of global finance. London's supremacy shifted quietly but decisively to New York. The empire that had ruled the seas was replaced by one that ruled the ledgers. Meanwhile, Germany's defeat didn't end its financial story, it restructured it. The same logic that had guided Versailles now returned in new form. Instead of crushing Germany with unpayable reparations, the Allies, led by the U.S., chose a different strategy: manageable debt for permanent dependence. West Germany would be rebuilt as a bulwark of capitalism against the Soviet bloc financed by American credit. East Germany, under Soviet control, would be stripped bare. One side would be enslaved by communism, the other by capitalism, but both by debt. Then came Bretton Woods, July 1944. While war still raged, 730 delegates from 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire. The official goal: prevent another depression. The real goal: lock the world into a dollar-based system. The U.S. dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce, and every other currency would peg to the dollar. The newly created International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, would oversee global credit flows. In effect, the debt machine that began in 1919 was reborn, with America as both architect and owner. By 1945, the blood of 50 million people had been transmuted into the greatest financial consolidation in human history. The world called it peace. The banks called it balance. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world looked to Washington for peace. What it received instead was a new empire, not of colonies, but of credit. Under the Marshall Plan, 1947, the United States sent $13 billion to Western Europe for reconstruction. Textbooks call it generosity, but the fine print told another story. These weren't donations. They were loans structured to guarantee repayment in dollars and open access for American corporations. In exchange for aid, nations had to buy American goods, adopt American economic models, and anchor their currencies to the dollar. Europe was rebuilt, yes, but rebuilt into dependence. Factories in France, Italy, and West Germany hummed again, but their prosperity rested on credit from across the Atlantic. The U.S. had achieved what Britain once dreamed of: the ability to extract global wealth not through conquest, but through currency. The Bank for International Settlements, which had once cleared Nazi gold, continued operations untouched. No prosecutions, no accountability. Its network of central bankers simply shifted focus from managing German reparations to managing post-war liquidity. It became the quiet cathedral of global finance, operating above governments, beyond public scrutiny. It still sits in Basel today, invisible, unassailable, eternal. Meanwhile, Germany, the nation whose debt had once enslaved Europe was reborn as the heart of Europe's new economic system under American supervision. Britain, broken and indebted, became a junior partner in the dollar order, and Japan, bombed to ashes, was reconstructed with U.S. loans, its miracle economy powered by American capital and technology. Then came the Cold War, a conflict less about ideology than about who controlled the debt machine. The U.S. borrowed trillions to build nuclear weapons, fund wars in Korea and Vietnam, and maintain 700 military bases across the globe. The Soviet Union borrowed billions from Western banks to stay afloat. When the USSR finally collapsed in 1991, it wasn't defeated by missiles, it was bankrupted by interest payments. From 1919 to today, the formula never changed. War creates debt. Debt creates dependence. Dependence creates control. The 2008 financial crisis was no different. Banks gambled, lost, and were bailed out with public money, transforming private failure into public debt. The same names that financed both world wars, J.P. Morgan, Chase, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, survived stronger than ever. Today, the global economy still orbits the dollar. The IMF and World Bank still impose austerity on poor nations in the name of reform. And the debt-based system that began with the Treaty of Versailles continues dressed in the language of freedom, backed by the mathematics of control. Wars end. Empires fall. But debt endures. And in that endurance lies the real victory of those who learned that money can rule where armies cannot.